Welcome to Professor Game Podcast, where we interview successful practitioners of games, gamification, and game thinking who brings the best of their experiences to get ideas, insights, and inspiration that help us in the process of getting the students to learn what we teach. And I'm Rob Alvarez. I teach and work at IE Business School in Madrid, where we create interactive and engaging learning materials. Want to know more? Go to professorgame.com/subscribe, start on our email list, and ask me anything. So engagers, today we have somebody very different from our typical guest. We have today Jamie Madigan, but before introducing Jamie, we would like to know, Jamie, are you prepared to engage?
Absolutely, 100%.
Let's do this, because Jamie Madigan is a PhD and has become an expert on the psychology of video games, and he seeks to popularize the understanding of how psychology can be used to understand why games are made, how they are made, and why their players behave as they do. He also writes podcasts and lectures on the subject for various magazines, website, and his own, of course, website, psychologyofgames.com. He has consulted with game development companies and talked at conferences about how game developers can incorporate psychology principles into game designs and how players can understand how it affects their play. So as you can see, it's very, very relevant to what we're always talking about. But of course, Jamie is not exactly that profile of somebody who's implementing gamification into the classroom or into some other setting. So today we will have a slightly different interview with some of the typical questions, but we would like to know and get as much useful information from Jamie as we can. So Jamie, is there anything that we missed from that intro that we should have mentioned?
No, I think you nailed it all. And different is good. I'll take different.
Yes,
I'm used to it.
Different is very good. Absolutely. That's why you're here, and that's why we're excited to have this episode today.
Well, thanks for having me on. This is it's always fun, and I'm glad to be here.
Absolutely. It's always also very nice to have fellow podcasters on the podcast, because it's somebody who's prepared for many things that some people are not. I mean, it's not out of bad will or anything, but that they're not as prepared for these kinds of things as you certainly are.
Turn my phone off. Everything's all set.
Yes, absolutely. So Jamie, what does a regular day with you look like? Because I know that just like me, you're drawing from two different worlds, like your regular work in your regular 9-to-5 job, and also what you do with the psychology of games.
Right. So, I have a day job that is not directly related to the psychology of games, but I'm the product manager for a company called LeaderAmp, and LeaderAmp has like science and technology to help facilitate and scale like leadership coaching. So if you're a manager and you want to develop some of your other managers' skills in certain areas, teamwork and scanning the environment and all these different types of skills that make for good leaders, like we can help you do that. So we have like an app, and I'm the product manager for that app. And in sort of running the roadmap for that, I try to bring in a lot of the things that I've learned about psychology of games and gamification, so that we'll be adding, features that sort of take advantage of those things and implement some of those things. But also for like almost the last 10 years, I started in late 2009. I've been doing this psychology of games thing, where I decided to start writing about sort of how various psychology principles and theories and phenomena can be used to explain like how games are made, or more to the point, like why are they so often made the way they are? Like what's the deal with, levels and loot boxes and challenges and leaderboards and all that kind of stuff. Like how can psychology explain why that stuff is so popular and why it keeps showing up? And then things around why games are marketed and sold and priced as they are. So what's kind of the consumer psychology behind that? And then sort of why do we behave the way we do when we play games? So, questions around sportsmanship, toxic behavior, do violent games make you violent? How gaming nostalgia, affects our purchasing intentions and that kind of stuff. And been having a lot of fun doing that. So, a typical day for me is to get up, and I usually get up around 6 a.m. and try to set aside an hour or so to work on psychology of game stuff, kind of while the rest of the house is waking up. So that may be researching, articles, reading articles, writing either blog posts or a book, or editing a podcast, or, some sort of article that I'm working on. And then I go to work. I go to work in my day job after that for the next 8 to 9 or so hours. And then sometimes in the evening, I'll turn back to the psychology of game stuff and keep tweaking away on that. And I like to fit in time to play what's current as well. So, I do gaming almost every night. Research, exactly right. So I read all that stuff off on my taxes. And I play games in the same office where I work all day. I'm lucky that I get to work from home. I have a home office that I work out of, which has its ups and downs, but which I love on balance. So that's kind of how the evenings go, along with, spending time with my family and hanging out with friends on the weekend and such.
Fantastic. It sounds very, very exciting. So I have two questions from what you were mentioning. One should be a quick one, and is, do violent video games make people violent?
There's an argument, a theoretical argument to be made both ways, but there's not any evidence that they do. There's not any good evidence that playing violent games or consuming any kind of violent media, for that matter, makes people engage in real world, violent behaviors.
It's the typical question, I'm sure. And
yeah.
And the other one, precisely because of your profile and how much you're constantly reading, looking into research articles and people who are doing a lot of research. What is something that you've been looking around for quite a while. What is something that you were looking for something and you found this paper or this research article or something around those lines, and you really were looking for one thing and something like completely surprised you. You weren't expecting that. What's something that's completely surprised you about these readings on the psychology of games?
Yeah, so I'm doing some research on the next book that I'm working on, and one of the chapters kind of had to do with motivation in video games. So, like, what can we learn about how to motivate people, like in the workplace, for example, based on what games do really well? And I kind of went into working on that chapter thinking like, well, games are really good at this, obviously, because, we all love to play games. We're extremely engaged and motivated to keep playing once we enjoy doing something. And I thought a big part of that would be the feedback that games give you about your performance, to say, you're doing this well, you're not doing this well. Here's how to master this skill. Here's how to progress in the game, and so forth. And and kind of working through the research and on what organizational psychologists have found out about effective feedback in the workplace, about, when managers do that well, what does it look like? Games checked off a lot of the boxes. So, you could see that games provide immediate feedback, for example. Like, they don't wait 6 months and give you an annual performance review. They give you like immediate feedback, like, you died, man, or, hey, you beat that boss, or you got through that level, or you scored the headshot, or whatever. So, like, the feedback is immediate and it's unambiguous as well. That's sort of one other major thing. It's not typically wishy-washy. You didn't say like, well, you did an all right job there. We'll talk more later. No, you get very clear feedback about how your performance relates to whatever goal you're trying to reach or whatever standard of performance you're trying to reach. And it does some other things along those lines. It's immediate. It's unambiguous. It kind of comes from a trusted source. You expect that the game knows what successful performance looks like, and it really gets it and can give you and can tell you whether or not your performance measured up. It doesn't get personal. Like, it bases feedback on outcomes. Like, you beat the level, you beat the boss, you progress. It doesn't say like, you're not good at this game. It just says you failed. You failed this level. Try again. It doesn't say you're not good enough. It says what you did wasn't good enough, which is the kind of approach that employees really like to have, and that they react to well, and that they'll use when they get that kind of thing. They'll tend to seek out feedback and use it more. Games use a mix of positive and negative feedback, and they very often couch feedback in terms of progress towards a goal, right? So, think about how many progress bars have you seen in the last 48 hours of playing games? Like, they're everywhere, right? But this idea of meaningful progress towards a goal is something that video games are very good at doing. So, I assume that this is it. The video games are the perfect model for how to motivate employees in the workplace, and we should just do everything that they do. But as I was digging into that research a little bit more and looking at these complete models of what makes for effective job performance feedback, for example, and I think this could apply equally well to the classroom. In fact, it does. A lot of the research that I looked at blurred those lines. It talked about effective feedback in both contexts, in both places. One thing that that video games don't do well, and I can't really think of an example of where a game has done this at all, is to focus on process and not results. So what I mean by that is, it doesn't say how you went about trying to play that match. So if you're playing like a round of Dota, for example, or some other kind of competitive game, it doesn't really talk about where you stood in the match and what upgrade paths you took and sort of when you chose to engage with the enemy and when you didn't and how you did that and which abilities you used and which abilities you used in conjunction with your teammates. Like there's all this kind of rich information available about the process that you use to try to succeed and win that match or play that game. But games are not really smart enough to key in on that or give you feedback about it. They really just kind of look at the results of you won, you lost, you died, you survived, that kind of stuff. So it is a major kind of shortcoming of games in terms of feedback. And I think that if there were sufficient advances in things like artificial intelligence or other technologies that could help change that, where a game could actually look at everything you did over the course of a match or a round or a level and give you specific feedback about what you did or didn't do well. Like, hey, you were trying to use a shotgun at long range. Why don't you try switching to like an assault rifle, in a game of Fortnite or something like that. That would be really amazing. And that kind of stuff is limited to third party. Either there's some software out there that does this kind of stuff. There's a website called WoW Analyzer for World of Warcraft Analyzer that you can feed it like logs of your combat into. You can feed it logs of your combat into, and it will spit out information like, you tried to use this skill when it was on cooldown, or you should have used these two skills in conjunction and for, more effective performance. But that stuff's all third party. And then, of course, you see people actually starting to hire themselves out as like coaches, like you want to get better at Fortnite, you want to get better at League of Legends. I will play with you for an hourly fee and I will give you feedback about your performance. But that requires a human intelligence.
Yeah.
So that was one thing that was kind of interesting, and it seems like a really fruitful area for games to evolve in. If they can introduce some technologies that allow them to do more of that, focusing on the process and not just the outcome.
I don't know if it's, of course, a very early or a very low stage for that, but I don't know if you've played the game The Last of Us.
Oh, yeah.
It kind of, I had the feeling, maybe it was wishful thinking, I'm not sure. You get killed pretty often. And
yeah.
Many times, that screen after you die that gives you typically, like it's loading and they give you like a message or something. Here, It usually gave like tips. I think it was aware of what was the stage in which you were in, but I found it like very, very relevant to what had just happened to me. And I usually found it was very, very useful to try and move on. It didn't give me like, oh, you have to take the door to the left instead of the door to the right. But it said things like, do you know these types of infected happen to only be shot in the feet? And that's how, it didn't tell you that's the only way to beat them, but it told you like, well, have you considered shooting the feet?
Yeah.
Like that kind of thing. I don't remember exactly many of those details, but I do remember it like gave you, like interesting things that you could maybe try and use. It didn't give you the full clues, but it gave you like hints like, oh, maybe you haven't tried this without telling you explicitly. So I'm not sure if it went with artificial intelligence or it was my wishful thinking, but I found it's like a pre-step to that.
Yeah. Yeah, if it did do that's great. But a lot of times those sort of tips or hints are just generic.
Yeah.
And they may be
random.
Specific. Yeah. It's like press B to crouch. Well, it's like, okay, great. That doesn't
I'm
really
on level
help.
25. I probably know
exactly.
that by now.
Yeah. But maybe, I think games are probably getting smarter to where they'll give you feedback about like mechanics that have unlocked at that stage of the game and not give you feedback on stuff that is not even available to you.
Yeah. It should be going in that way. I'm sure there's many things going on. And in that sense, is there, I don't know, I would like to know, what are you currently working on in as far as the psychology of games? What's something that you're finding interesting right now, like your interest? Where is it going to right now? What are you working on?
Well, I mean, trying to keep the podcast and the website going is sort of a perpetual thing. I try to post a podcast and an article every month, one of each every month. Always out there looking for interesting guests. And I just recorded like 3 podcasts in the last couple of weeks, actually. So I'm in pretty good shape there. But I've got some people that were talking about the Psychology and the Legend of Zelda book, and these were like clinicians who deal with sort of counseling and mental health issues, and that was really interesting because a bunch of different authors, like an author would write a chapter each, and it was really cool to talk through that, and that's a book that came out just a couple of weeks ago. To get a sneak peek at what's going on there, and I talked to somebody who's actually like a marketing professor and has like an academic background in marketing and publishes a lot. So he doesn't just teach it, but he actually like does research and writes papers. And he wrote this really interesting paper that's coming out later this year about some of the psychology behind collecting digital items. So, like, why do we want to collect Pokemon? And, why do we want to collect all the pieces to this armor set in World of Warcraft? Why do we want to, collect all of these items when they're not physical and it could sort of disappear at any moment, and we can't, in many cases, trade them or do anything with them.
I don't know if you've heard of Yukai Chao.
No.
He has a book called Octalysis. One of the stories he tells about there, he's a gamification designer, and he talks about like one of his big aha moments was when I don't know which Diablo it was, but he was like a huge fan. He had spent like 15,000 hours playing the game,
Wow.
getting every single thing. All of his friends were in Diablo, and all of a sudden, I don't know if it was like an upgrade to the next Diablo or it was another game that everybody went into. And he was very sad because he realized that all the time he had spent on that game was not something that he could transfer to another game, to another ability, to something that was in real life. And he was kind of depressed in a way. Like, what if I had spent those 15,000 hours learning 2 new languages or made I don't know, something that I could apply in my daily life? And that's when he started realizing and thinking about how he could apply his lessons from games into other areas, and thus his whole theory. It was, of course, this is a story mode way of talking about it, but it was like that moment when, why would I be spending all this time in something that in the end is going to bring me nothing? So I found it like very, very related to that thing, as you were saying, like, why do we collect these items that in the end they're going to be worth absolutely nothing to us?
Yeah, and I think there's something to be said about just entertainment and enjoying your life and making friends through playing multiplayer games or talking about games that you play together and developing, hobbies and interests. And there's plenty of people that have gone on to learn how to, code or do art or do sound design, like make a podcast, for example, because of their fandom with games. So, I think that just because you spend a large amount of time doing something does necessarily mean that it wasn't worth it.
Absolutely.
Maybe it was.
He has a growing consultancy on gamification. He's doing great. I mean, and it's not just thanks to that, it's thanks to many other things. And he's a very smart guy, and he's studied and he's created a paradigm, a shift, etc. But what I mean is that he didn't lose his time, but it was like that moment when you say, well, I spent all these hours in this, and why would I do that? And he started thinking about the psychology of why do we do these things? He created this Octalysis framework, etc. I think it would be an interesting read for you, and even perhaps a guest for your podcast as well.
Yeah, no, I made a note to myself. I'm definitely going to check that out.
Octalysis is probably the easiest way to, it's like analysis, but instead of analysis, it's octalysis.
Octalysis. Okay. Are there 8 parts to it, or is that just, do you like the sound, I guess?
Absolutely.
So, yeah, I mean, those are a couple of things I've been working on. And then I've also had like the paperback version of my book was just released earlier this month. Which was really great to see, since the publisher that I worked with doesn't typically do like paperback editions, but it had sold well enough they decided to do it. And then I just signed a contract to create an audiobook version of Getting Gamers as well. Yeah, that's going to come out later this year.
It's a different book, or it's from the same book?
It's the same book. It's just that they wanted to do an audio version of it, and we had retained the rights to do that, or I had retained the rights to sell those.
I was going to ask you about that because I hear, like, on a completely different note, I hear to some podcasts on entrepreneurship, etc. And there was this guy that every time they talk about it, he always insists, like, when you write a book, keep the rights to the audiobook. There's a lot to be said about audiobooks.
Audiobooks and foreign translations, into other languages, that kind of stuff. My agent was really good. Like, she made sure that we retained all that sort of stuff, and it paid off. So
cool, very nice. Just a quick break before we continue with this episode. If you've been enjoying this podcast, I would really appreciate if you share it with your friends and family and on social media. On Twitter and Instagram, it's @RobAlvarezB and the hashtag ProfessorGame, all one word. And on Facebook, you can find the Professor Game page. Thanks in advance for your engagement. So Jamie, we're going to move on into some different questions. And the first one that I wanted to make is, when you're thinking about people and creating games and the psychology of games, is there any recommendation that you would give people when creating games or using gamification for their projects? Like, use this best practice, and in general, you will probably be benefiting from that in your project, be that a game, perhaps even a gamification design, etc. Is there such a thing from your studies?
Yeah, I mean, there's a lot of potential great recommendations you could give somebody asking that question, but one of them that I would definitely make is make sure you involve the science, behind this sort of stuff. And if you're working with a consultant, or if you're trying to figure out how to implement something on your own, be familiar with, I have a bias towards psychology. So, I'll say be familiar with sort of the psychology behind what you're trying to do. So if you're trying to increase intrinsic motivation, for example, if you're trying to get people to set and act on goals, then understanding, the psychology of goal setting theory and all those kinds of things, and try to make sure the people you're working with understand that type of stuff as well. Because a lot of these, gamification techniques are ultimately born from things we know about human psychology, right? So, like, we do them because they aid in engagement, or they aid in learning. And there's certain ways to structure that stuff. And I think there are people out there who understand that better and worse than others. So just based on my own observations of what I've seen, the people who really lean into the science and lean into the theory that underlies what they're doing, and are willing to sort of experiment and run trials and do constant, improvement and change things up in accordance with new information that comes to light. In other words, thinking like a scientist, I think are going to be more successful in the short, medium, and long run.
Yeah, and you can see, there was this whole Gartner thing that says gamification was going to die. The hype is over because 80% are going to fail. I mean, I don't know what's the ratio for games, but I'm sure it's pretty bad as well. And that doesn't make it an industry that's not growing and getting better every time. It's because there's people who are not doing it well. It doesn't mean that everybody's not doing it well.
Yeah. I mean, kind of an example of that was a guy that I had on my podcast recently, Richard Landers, who is an organizational psychologist who studies gamified systems, and he studies if you were to try to make an assessment that you might use to evaluate somebody's skill in a certain area, or maybe like their general mental ability or their personality, of taking, we've had 100 years plus of those kinds of assessments and tests in various areas, but taking stuff like that and turning it into a game, something like what you might play on your smartphone to kill some time while you're waiting in line or something. And he published a paper earlier, might have been late last year, but he published a recent paper where they looked at leaderboards in the workplace. And he basically applied like goal setting theory to leaderboards, which wasn't like his original idea. I think there's people that's been writing about that. But he basically, had these 4 or 5 different groups of people. They were performing a task, or they were like trying to come up with creative uses for like a common object. It's like a common creativity research task. And he had some of them set like no goal to how many uses they could come up with, and had some people set like an easy goal, and some people set like a difficult goal, and some people set like a patently impossible goal. And then he had another group that he didn't have anybody set any goals, but he had them look at a leaderboard while they worked on it. So they would like type their uses for, I think it was like a kitchen knife or something, into this computer. And sort of as they kept coming up with more and more uses, they could see like their initials in the leaderboard kind of moving up towards like the top of the leaderboard. And they had constructed this leaderboard, which was, of course, full of like fake data. But, they had made it so that like if you reached the top of the leaderboard, that was the same as the people in the impossible goal condition reaching their goal. Or if you were near the top, that was the same as the people in like the difficult goal condition. And he found that like just having a leaderboard had the same effect as having a difficult or even impossible goal in terms of performance, like how hard people tried on this task and how well they did. And so the idea was like, well, that may be why leaderboards work, is they encourage people to make these social comparisons with those around them and adopt goals for performance. And, we know from decades of research on goal setting that if you set, a difficult but possible goal, and if you're committed to it, then your performance is going to increase, most likely. So I thought that was really interesting and a great application of the kind of thing I was just talking about a minute ago of, application of science to and research to a gamification project.
Absolutely.
Because they made the point that like, well, we also know from goal setting theory that you have to be committed to the goals. So, if the numbers on that leaderboard had been like a global leaderboard, for example, it was like everybody in the world who's using this, who's working on this task, then we might not be committed to that because they're like, well, I don't know who these people are and I'm not really interested in competing against them. So I'm not going to really be committed to this goal. And thus it's not going to impact my performance that much.
Yeah, that makes sense. And there's many theories around leaderboards in themselves. And there's good ways to apply them and terrible ways to do so as well. But on that same sense, we were talking a lot about your routine at the beginning, and you mentioned that you do a lot of research as well as in playing games. What would you say, Jamie, is your favorite game?
Oh, man. Yeah, I mean, that's tough. That's like picking your favorite child, right? And it's something that kind of, I've been playing games for 35, 40 years, at this point in my life. So at different times in my life, I've had different types of games. When I was a kid, it was like the Ultima role-playing games. And then, later it was like the first-person shooters like Quake and Half-Life. And then it sort of changed over time. But, I'd say currently probably like the Dark Souls series, which are, I don't know if you're familiar with them, but they're like action-adventure, set in like a swords and sorcery and castles and dragons and, that kind of pastiche.
I actually got Dark Souls remastered 1 and 3 that I understand is a continuation of 1 and 3. I got it for Christmas.
Yeah, you should dive in. They're great games. And they're kind of noted for being very punishing. Like they're not necessarily unfair, but like, man, it's on you to like figure out what you're doing wrong. I'm kind of going back to the feedback discussion, right? So if you don't, learn to engage properly with different enemies, like you're just going to get killed every time. And you've got to, kind of figure out where to go in the world to do the next step and how to beat different bosses. And you have to switch things up and you have to adapt your behavior based on what the game is telling you and what you're learning about how to do well. And there's like no, trash mobs, meaning like there's no just low level fodder enemies that you just plow through. Like almost anything in that game can kill you if you're not careful, even, from the first encounter on.
Yeah.
But they're so well designed. They're like masterworks in terms of like level design and game design and how the movement and the combat and everything flows together. They're just a lot of fun to play. And I've played through each of them at least 3 times.
Wow. That's a feat.
Yeah. Using different builds and different approaches. It's a lot of fun.
Yeah, I'm sure it is. So Jamie, in that same vein, we were talking about people that you've interviewed, that you've talked to. You're constantly interviewing people as well. Who would you say would be an interesting profile? Somebody that you would like to listen to his or her perspectives in an interview like this one in Professor Game?
So again, kind of going back to what I said, like somebody who's doing academic research around gamification specifically, and I'm sure you've probably interviewed some of those people before. Or somebody who's at a company or a consulting firm who is creating these sort of game-based assessments of, you want to assess a bunch of people very efficiently, and you want them to be sort of engaged with the whole process and enjoy taking a test, which
is there somebody that comes to mind?
So, the guy that I mentioned before, Richard Landers,
Yep.
it would be a great choice, I think. He knows a lot about both gamification, gamified experiences, and he's kind of come up with a whole taxonomy of how he thinks about the differences between games, gamification, gamified experience, game-like experiences. So he's somebody who's thinking through that sort of stuff very systematically and then piecing together what that means for implementing it to solve real world problems or to have real world applications. So he would definitely be a good person to have on.
Fantastic. Richard Landers. I think somebody already proposed him as well, but I think it's time to reach out for sure.
So I always say Miyamoto, like everybody says that, right? So
why not? Yeah.
Put me down. See if you can get a hold of him. He's not doing much these days, right?
Yeah. Jamie, aside of course from your own book, is there another book that you would recommend as well? We will have links to your book as well in the show notes in professorgame.com. You can just look for Jamie Madigan and you'll get to the show notes. But is there any book that you would recommend to the engagers? And why would you recommend that book?
Yeah, I mean, especially if you're interested in the whole psychology of games, topic and how psychology theory and the various subdisciplines of it can be applied to video games and even gamification and those sorts of interactions. There's a book called The Gamer's Brain by Celia Hodent, and she's a PhD in cognitive psychology, I'm almost certain, but some kind of psychology. And she wrote this book that is sort of all about cognitive psychology and how that would benefit people who are making games and sort of making specifically like user interfaces for games, because that's kind of her background, where she talks a lot about user experience design and user interface design. And so it's like, things like how many pieces of information can we handle? How do emotions affect how we interact with systems? How do, our cognitive limitations interact with or change how we interact with different systems? So that's kind of the first half of the book. And then the back half is all about like UX, UI, user experience, user interface design, and sort of applying those lessons to very specific problems that those types of people encounter.
Sounds like a very exciting book.
Yeah, I mean, I think so. But it's you can't pay short shrift to those types of issues if you're designing like a gamification system, right? Like you need to make sure that people can effectively interact like with the screen or the tool or whatever, or the person or whatever it is. So she takes kind of a very broad approach to that kind of stuff. And it is in the context of video games, but I think it has applications to neighboring territory as well.
Yeah, absolutely. And that's where we learn from. We learn from video games and try to apply from games, video games, board games, card games, etc. And we apply it to other contexts and situations. That's what's gamification is about. Game-based learning is actually creating game-based or games or using existing games into learning settings. So it's absolutely and very directly related to everything that the listeners are interested in. So thank you very much for this interview. I thank you very much for your time, Jamie. I know you have a busy schedule. You have, just like I do, double or even triple job. So I really thank you for taking some of your time to dedicate to the engagers, to talking to us today. And I would like to leave the engagers with some final piece of advice that you might want to give them. Of course, let us know where we can find you, your book, Plug Zone in general. Let us know where we can find everything about you. And then we'll say it's game over.
Okay. Yeah, I mean, the best way to track me down is to go to psychologyofgames.com. The website's there, and you can find information about how to find the book, how to subscribe to my podcast, how to follow me on social media, especially I'd say Twitter, which I'm at Jamie Madigan there. You can follow me there. I'm pretty low volume there, so I usually only post stuff that I think people will be interested in, pointers to other good stuff that I found on the web, and whenever I put something new up on the website. But yeah, psychologyofgames.com is definitely the best place to find me.
Absolutely. It's a great place to do so.
All right. Well, thanks.
Is there any final advice that you would like to leave the listeners with?
I'm not sure exactly anything specific. Just think through. And I'm always a fan of when people take, theory and research and apply it to real world problems. That's kind of why I work in the field that I do. And it's why I became so interested in writing about the psychology of video games, because it's always neat to sort of peel back and discover like, oh, well, that's why this works. And you got to be, curious about that kind of stuff and willing to go looking for it. But I think it's well worth it when you do find it.
Absolutely. I couldn't agree more. I think taking theories that exist or even creating new theories and applying them is fundamental. And that connection between what is researched and found and how it can be applied to real life, I think it's central, and it's something that we sometimes miss as both as researchers on one side and as application people or practitioners on the other end. I think there's a lot of opportunities that could come out from doing that a lot more. So thank you, Jamie, once again. It's been a pleasure to have you in the podcast. I think there were a lot of insights that we got from your work. There's going to be a lot more when we go into your webpage and see all the things that you're up to. But now it's time to say that it's game over.
Awesome. Well, thanks for having me on. This is always fun.
Engagers, thank you for listening to Professor Game Podcast. If you want more interviews like this one with the incredible guest Jamie Madigan, then go to professorgame.com/subscribe and get started in our email list. That way, we can be in contact and you will be the first to know of any opportunities that Professor Game might have for you. And before you go on to your next mission, would you like to know a little bit more about research, academia, and how gamification can be applied to classes, to classrooms, to education? Then you have to listen to Adam Palmquist. So all you have to do is subscribe using your favorite podcast app and listen to the next episode of Professor Game. See you there.